Welcome to another episode of the People Over Perks podcast by Leapsome. In each episode, we speak with a people operations leader about how they're building a high-performance culture in their company. In today's episode, we speak with Matt Bradburn, the co-founder of the People Collective. We talk to Matt about the concept of people debt, career progression frameworks, salary benchmarking, and a lot more. Enjoy this conversation. So, Matt, thanks for joining us this morning on the People Over Perks podcast. You are the co-founder of the People Collective. Let's kick off with what is the People Collective?
So thanks for having me, Andy. The People Collective is a small consultancy. We work with startups and scale-ups to help them really put in the foundations to help the businesses scale, both in terms of their people, in terms of recruitment, and in terms of kind of broader people operations, to help them become more effective and help them reach their own growth plans and growth trajectories.
Interesting, cool. And so perhaps you could walk us through your career journey in terms of what led you to start the People Experience. What were some of the things that you experienced when you were working in-house that made you realize there was a need to be solved with a consultancy?
Yeah, so I started very much in the kind of classic scenario, classic millennial scenario, right? Graduated in the middle of a financial crisis. Terrible idea. Wanted to move into marketing, ended up in recruitment. So started my career as a recruitment consultant and got to work with so many little kind of tiny, fascinating businesses at the time. Companies like Ocado, companies like Autonomy, companies who went on to obviously become great, well-known names in terms of tech. And I was really amazed by the scale and the speed at which these companies could grow. So decided to move in-house, worked as an in-house recruiter for a few years, but found my real passion was actually not just hiring people into these businesses, but watching their development paths, right? And actually seeing the ways that these people were able to expand their careers, their capabilities, the possibilities for them within these businesses. But also at the same time, we saw the way that businesses can trip over their own feet, should we say, and come across a bunch of pitfalls which kind of halted their development. And most of those pitfalls weren't related to product market fit. They were related to their ability to turn a great product idea into a long-term viable business. So my last job before I started the People Collective was as VP of People at Peakon, which is an employee engagement software company, which is very meta, right? This idea that you might think about how employee engagement is employed within an employee engagement business. But even there, there were certainly challenges within the business which had to be solved. And I wanted the opportunity to solve these across not just one business at a time, but be able to work with companies, a broad range of companies and solve a broad range of problems and have much more kind of impact on the wider world of startups and scale-ups. So that's kind of how the career journey influenced what we set out to build.
Cool, thanks for sharing that. And so then, very tangibly, what are some of the projects that you work on with your clients now with the People Collective?
Yeah, it was very, it's fascinating. When we started the company, I was 99% sure that we were going to spend a lot of time on recruitment process, on onboarding process, maybe a little bit of like performance development here and there. Turns out that wasn't the case. We were completely wrong. Couldn't have been further off, right? So actually, the majority of our time is spent on projects focused on areas like leveling and progression. So thinking about clear progression pathways for people within organizations, compensation and reward. So looking at broader compensation philosophies and helping startups really plan for their own futures. Manager development. So, the majority of companies promote their best ICs to become managers. This is not the best way to go about it. So helping put in the support to give people the confidence and capability to improve. And then, talking to obviously the team at Leapsome, performance development, right? How does this all come together to kind of help people develop and continuously grow within the business, which obviously then helps the businesses grow themselves.
Super interesting, and there's a lot to unpack there that we'll dive into. But before we do that, perhaps you could explain this concept of people debt. What does that mean, and how does it kind of manifest itself in the business?
Yeah, I mean, for kind of for better or worse, like, we all have an experience with debt, whether it's a mortgage, a business loan, or the kind of maxed out credit cards that you cut up and hide in the freezer. No judgments from me there. But debt is kind of what you borrow from the future for today. And personal and business finances aren't the only places we see this occurring. So engineering teams have adopted this term technical debt to describe the kind of compromises that you accept for temporary increase in velocity. And there's a decrease in long-term velocity as these compromises become bumps you have to work around in the future. So in tech, as in finance, we kind of accrue this debt as a shortcut to the end result, and the same applies to HR, right? So in startups, it's not unusual to take an easy, what my co-founder terms kind of quick and dirty approach to expedite the delivery of what they see as what they think will be a great culture, right? So we've seen this in the past with, like, I don't know, ping pong tables or dogs in the offices, or like, let's put in a share option scheme, or yay, unlimited holiday. But despite whatever impact these small perks might have on employee morale, they do very little in terms of furthering the business. And actually, there are some kind of really fundamental aspects of building an organization which need to be put in place. So when we think about HR debt, it's really kind of borrowing and compromising on your long-term future to solve in the short term, because you're running around chasing your tail doing a million things. But actually, what we try and do and help companies work through is, like, how can you plan for the longer term, right? How can we actually put in the foundations to help the organization scale and grow? Because it's not just a debt that's for the HR team to pay. The whole business will be left feeling the effects of a fairly hefty bill, right? And there's a quote from a chap called Steve Blank who termed it kind of organizational debt, which is, just when things should be going great, HR debt can turn a growing company into a chaotic nightmare, which sums it up perfectly.
Yeah, it does. It sure does. And so, in your experience, is this something that, like, is almost inevitable that companies go through, or is it avoidable, given the right setup and structures?
It's one of those things that's like, it's avoidable if you target it early enough, right? The way it manifests itself is really through, like, poor communication practices, like a lack of expectations, no clarity on goals, no clarity on how to progress in the business, and no understanding of, like, what you're being assessed against in a performance review. No clear structures for recruitment or hiring, like everyone asking the same question, interview to interview to interview. And all of these things are quite structured and formulaic, right? Like, we've identified a lot of the key areas where they manifest.
Mm-hmm.
So it's all about really broaching these early enough so that you're able to solve for the longer term, as opposed to leaving them and seeing what happens. We term it as, like, kind of growing an organization by design as opposed to default. When it's left to grow by default, that's when it gets really problematic. When you grow the organization by design and you put time thinking about, like, people operations as a product, as Jess Hayes, one of your former guests, talks about quite a lot.
Yeah.
When you put that kind of product mentality in it, you think, what am I building? Who is the user? How are they going to use it? What's the kind of fundamental commercial need for the business for this to be in place? Then it can really help you. So as long as you tackle it early, like when you're kind of somewhere between 10 and 50 people, you can put yourself in a good spot. But I would say at the same time that it's pretty much inevitable, right?
Yeah, that's super interesting. And so, we now have a clear picture as to what the problems are.
Yep.
Now let's dive into some of those solutions then, and the ways that businesses can solve this. Perhaps we should start with career progression frameworks as a starting point. Tell us about how a business should approach that if they're doing this for the first time.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting area of people operations, right? One that has almost gone through, like, several waves. Like, when you think of, like, career progression and leveling, like, the first thing that comes to my mind is, like, massive bank, right? or large consultancy, and you're like, okay, cool. I start off as an associate, I become a principal, then I move to a VP or an EVP or a GM, whatever, right? And you're like, okay, then I'm going to have this massive ream of like specific skills that I need to fulfill at every single level. And it becomes like a really big checkbox exercise, and that causes a lot of frustration in itself, right? So it can definitely bring problems when it's kind of not put together well. But the way that we tend to kind of see this new wave of career progression coming through is like, how can we set like stage appropriate expectations for people in the business, right? What do we expect of people across the organization in a broader set of competencies? So things like how you communicate or how you work together as a team, but then give some examples of what that means by level, as opposed to kind of going into this ream of skills. So you move it from being this like horrendous checkbox exercise where you're like, this person must fulfill every skill before they get a promotion, to this point where it's like a founding document, and it forms the foundations for having great conversations between managers and their teams. And that's what people are craving, right? Is they're not getting really tangible, useful feedback from their managers. Like, that's the problematic piece. So when we're thinking about what career progression looks like, it's really all about creating space for great conversations to happen, and giving people an opportunity to close a perception gap, which is probably an area worth thinking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And then obviously the salary benchmarking must fit into all this somewhere. How does that tie in?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, that one, right? Like, there's so many ways to kind of build your broader compensation plans and like approach and philosophy, right? You're seeing this even more with everyone being remotely right now. Do we tie this to a city? Do we tie this to levels? Do we tie this to skills? Are we like what kind of rate do we want to pay within a certain market? Do we want to pay like some teams the 50th percentile and some teams the 90th percentile? Because we know that, I don't know, like machine learning engineers in Berlin are really hard to come by, but I don't know, like customer success people in London, a little bit easier to find. Therefore, we can pay a little bit lower than market, or kind of against average. So when you're working through these problems, it can be really helpful to think about like not just the benchmarks themselves, but how you're actually going to apply this and what this means for your teams. And I think that's the big thing, right? It's like, what's going to be the right approach for us as a business? Like, what aspects and values do we have that could influence this in the first place? And how should that play out and align with the progression framework? So it might be like, we have certain bandings for certain levels. It might be like we completely decouple it, also fine. It might be like, we stick to our kind of core market rates. Or it could be, I've seen some companies go like, yeah, we want to have a fixed rate, and there's one salary, the calculator spits it out, and that's what we're going to pay. Which actually we employed at Peakon, and I was amazed. Very few people were unhappy with the number, and walked away from a role at Peakon just because of a singular number, which was great to see. So it shows kind of, compensation plays a role in why people choose a company, but it's not the be all and end all for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there are obviously many other components that come into consideration there, aren't there?
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. And so then we've got the career progression framework, and obviously then the compensation framework as well. But then you touched on the fact that obviously ultimately what people need is great feedback from their managers. And so how do you build those processes in order to create an environment where there is great professional development?
Yeah, so it's such like it's a topic I'm super passionate about at the moment, right? I think, you must have seen this at Leapsome, watching people move from like this annual performance review, this position where you're like, cool, let's bring in like all the recency bias in the world into this piece of feedback, right? So, Andy, can you tell me what you ate last Friday for lunch?
No chance.
No, exactly right. Like if you can't tell me what you had for lunch last Friday, how on earth are you going to know what that person on your team was doing really well last January? And managers are notoriously bad at keeping track of these things, kind of like in the interim, right? So you've got obviously a few emerging models like this idea of continual performance, which I've got a bit of a love-hate relationship with, because I don't think it kind of means everything and nothing all in one, like as a term. It can mean to some people like, yeah, I'm going to give really useful, tangible, regular feedback. To others, it can be like, I don't know what this means for me, and I feel uncomfortable giving regular feedback, so I'm just going to kind of revert and ignore it and not do anything with it, right? So it depends on the kind of capabilities of the managers in the team. But I think what we're seeing at the moment as like a really like solid foundational process is like, once you've got the career progression framework in place, that sets the expectations, right? And that's the key that's often missing. So we talk about this idea of a perception gap that often exists. So I'm employee X, and I think I'm this good, like I'm doing like pretty well. I'm manager of employee X, and I think they're doing this good. And this is the bit that they don't talk about, right? Like no one wants to discuss that, but it's really uncomfortable. And managers hate having uncomfortable conversations. We've interviewed over 1,200 managers over the last 2 years. And the single biggest challenge that they always cite as the area they want to improve at, and the area they recognize as being an issue for them, is broaching what they term as difficult conversations. And most of those align to compensation and performance, right? So if you've got the career progression as a kind of founding document, it makes it much easier to talk about those expectations, to have open and candid feedback. But the really big thing is like, you've got to train the managers to be able to do this really well. Like I don't know if this is something that Leapsome notice as well, is like, the quality of feedback is pretty much always aligned to the quality of the manager who's able to give it, and their ability to have confidence to give it well.
Yeah, absolutely. And so obviously, you touched on the importance of the individual manager there. But what really is the role and responsibility of the people operations team in order to help facilitate that, develop the managers? Like how does that sort of balance play out?
Yeah, so I think when you've got it's like a hub and spoke model, right? Like you want enough kind of centralization that there is a clear process, that everyone understands what the clear process is, that there's like organizational consistency. So, we're consistent on what great feedback looks like. We're consistent on what the expectations are. We're consistent around like our approach to pay rises, things like that. But then like, that's when you want to start bringing like the manager's personality into it, right? Is when it comes to not just what great feedback looks like, but how you play each peer person on the team. Like we often talk with managers around this idea of like chess versus checkers. So an average manager is playing a game of checkers, right? They're not thinking strategically about the longer term for the organization. They're thinking much more like transactionally, and they're playing each character as if they were the same. But the best managers, they understand those individual motivations and strengths of each person on their team. They're playing a game of chess, right? And they can strategically build and develop their team by focusing on those strengths, like coaching those strengths, giving really good feedback around how to continuously develop those, as well as kind of weaknesses as well. But they focus much more on building a team to counter weaknesses, as opposed to trying to force everyone to do exactly the same job. Again, I don't want to call on Jess too much, but she picked this up really well, right? Like when building a people ops team, it's not about building a kind of set of Russian dolls who all fit on top of each other. It's about like, right, cool, we need some people who can do a bit of engineering. We've got this skill here that could make them super good at like learning some data analysis. So, I think the role of the manager is really like understanding their team strengths and then being able to help with the feedback around that.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. And so what does great manager development look like then? And is that really the people operations team's responsibility to make sure that there are good components and processes in place for training the managers?
I think I wouldn't say this is the responsibility of the people operations team. I'd say this is like CEO level responsibility, right? Like, you'll often see these kind of Twitter threads about like, what should a CEO focus on? Like they must be great at hiring, they must be great at fundraising. But I often see either CEO or COO, depending on size of the business, like also has to be great at building a team who can develop those beneath them continuously, right? Like that team's constantly got to be thinking in terms of, how do I give away my Legos? How can I constantly, look to improve the way that I set expectations, to delegate to people, right? So it's not really like, the responsibility of an HR team to make sure that's in place. Yeah, they might facilitate it, but it's the responsibility of the founders and the leadership team to make sure that other managers and leaders who are coming into the business have all the tools they need to be successful. And that's what we see as like, such a common issue is they're like, yeah, you were so amazing at this job. Please take this role as manager, or even worse, like they've designed the organization where the only route to progress is to become a manager, right? Which is so common. Like this is how companies have been structuring things since the 1920s. So you've got to be a people manager, but actually, if you design your organization with like dual tracks, let people be great ICs or let people be great managers, then I think you can remove that singular bar to development. And at the same time, you can start to remove this idea that middle managers are completely useless and a waste of time, right? I think we've simply been promoting the worst people, or the people who aren't necessarily best suited to management roles. And therefore, if you can think about like, how does org design fit with manager development, then you can put yourself in a really good spot.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'd love to shift gears and talk about employee engagement.
Yeah, go for it.
What's your opinion on how a business should be measuring employee engagement? How should they be structuring their engagement surveys if they should be doing those sorts of processes? And yeah, what's your view on how a business can really be capturing feedback from the employees in order to make improvements?
Yeah, it's a really good question, right? And like obviously engagement has been one of those things that's like a bit of a buzzword over the last say let's 5 to 10 years, right? And it's definitely got its place, but it's a really interesting one. Like I obviously, having worked for an employee engagement business, have seen some pros and some cons to it. There are a lot of pros, like actually, soliciting feedback from your team, listening to it, and really importantly, like acting on it. Like it's no point just having a dashboard. Like you really got to help managers like act upon it, make changes in the business. Like that's the big, the reason it should exist. But gift and a curse, it can become a place where people become a little bit entitled, should we say, from time to time. Maybe start moaning, there aren't enough avocados in the fridge. That is a genuine response I've seen before. Or my personal favorite, when someone was complaining to me because we had Spotify set up in the office. And they were complaining to me that the recommendations on Spotify, because it was their account linked to the Sonos system, that their recommendations were being messed up. And this was incredibly unfair, and that it was very important that we needed to buy a company Spotify account immediately. I was like, come on, people. So it's a gift and a curse, right? Like when it's done really well, and when you're structuring good questions, like understanding what's people's workload looking like, having useful check-ins to understand, like how can I further help you as a manager, like guide and support and develop you, and looking at like the broader themes and how they turn into actions. It's really good, but a couple of areas it can become troublesome is like, like using it as a replacement for having great managers, and having those managers have conversations, or when you just get a situation where there's a whole bunch of entitlement, which isn't so fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think there's potentially a gap there, isn't there, is in terms of what's important for the business and what's important to the employee in some cases.
Always, right? And that kind of gap or like clash point is like something that we see so much in our work, right? You got to really finely balance like what are the commercial needs of the business, what are the people needs of the business, and how can we make sure that we craft and build people processes that support commercial outcomes, whilst also bearing in mind that we want to build a place that people have the opportunity to be really successful, and one where we're kind of honest and true to what we say we're going to be, as per Brewdog's issue last week, when they said that they're the nicest company in the world and they're saving the world, and their employees said it's a horrendous hellhole of a business to work for.
Yeah, that letter went quite viral, didn't it?
Oh, it did indeed, right? It kind of been a fun week to be the Brewdog CEO, but then you stick yourself on a pedestal and you say these things, then you're setting yourself up, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that letter was circulated in our Slack community, and we'll make sure that we link to it in the show notes as well for the people who haven't yet seen it, because it does make an interesting read.
Yeah.
And you of course said about how you need to turn this feedback into action at the end of the day. Do you have a sort of tangible playbook as such for distilling this feedback and actually turning it into something that creates results, and then that the employees can see that you are taking action rather than just collecting the feedback and leaving it on a shelf?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, that, and again, like a super fine balance between saying you're going to take action and then just actually just doing the darn thing, right? So, ways that we've helped a few companies with this is like starting to split out like some of the themes that you're seeing, and then either assigning like small working groups. Say if you've got like a thematic issue around like goal setting within the business, like people, I don't know, how the vision of the company connects to what I'm supposed to be doing on a day-to-day basis, let's say. So then like you like put together like a small working group, not like an executive level thing where you discuss it at the leadership team meeting week in, week out, like massive waste of time, but like a small working group to like analyze the feedback, start to put together plans that they can bring those goals to life, and then act on it super quickly, and be like, right, we've listened to your feedback. These are the plans that we've made. These are the changes that we're going to implement. If these changes work, great, but let us know if they're not working for you, and if we need to do more, and we'll continue to work on this. So that's like one way. The other way is obviously on the individual basis. So like specific targeting, you might see one manager who's like, their entire team is like, help, I'm drowning. This is horrendous, whereby you're kind of speaking to them very directly and be like, look, we're getting super clear feedback here, that your team are drowning in workload. Do you have enough people on your team? Are you giving them enough space? Are you encouraging them to actually take breaks, and not just encouraging them, but like making space for them to take some breaks? We're seeing this one a lot with like remote burnout, is a lot of managers will say, yeah, take next Monday off. And the employee's like, I don't need next Monday off because then I've got to do 5 days working 4 days. Instead, a great manager will be like, I'm going to work with you. I can see you've got these 3 key priority things which need to come up. I'm delegating that one to so-and-so. I'm delegating this one to so-and-so. And I'm going to make sure that you have space, that you can take a break properly, and you don't have to think about or worry about this stuff, right? So there's the individual basis. And then it's like the longer term ones, right? So which of these actually feed into like, deep rooted company issues and are much more like kind of symptomatic, at which point you're like, right, as CEO, I need to look at these, and this is where we kind of push it to the founder, and you're like, these are things that you need to better embed within the organization to like help the culture thrive.
Yeah, that's so many good points in there. And then to add to that, have you seen any communication formats that work particularly well for then communicating this back into the organization? Obviously, some that come to mind, sort of all company email chains, all hands meetings, these sorts of things. Have you seen any that work particularly well, or others that you would potentially avoid?
I mean, the only one to avoid? Slack messages, right? Like it's like it's like a freaking Bloomberg feed, right? Like you're going to lose sight of that in seconds, and like its lack of permanence kind of bleeds into your how your employees will then take that on board or think about it, right? So if it's something that's like a permanent major kind of business decision shift, like be super clear with the team about that. So it would probably need reiterating, not just in the email, but also at an all hands. Or if it's like a big change, like do an AMA in the all hands, like get the founder up there. We're talking about the founder making structural changes. You're like, have the founder there, get people to ask them questions in advance, and be able to come and be vulnerable about what you're doing, what you're working on, and what these changes will mean like in practice, and why you believe they're important, right? Like show that you actually care. I think that's an important one. But don't get me started on all hands. We'll be here for like another hour if I start talking about how all hands meetings are run.
Yeah, I can imagine that's a big topic.
Yeah, they're generally terribly, right? But
Yeah, absolutely. And so I would love to pick your brain a little bit in terms of how you have thought about your own career development along the way. Having progressed to VP of People, have you kind of come up with any frameworks or thought processes for yourself in terms of developing in the world of people ops?
Yeah, it kind of like always changes and shifts. So there's like three areas that I like to bear in mind, and this kind of helps me like change and adapt, because my role has completely changed and adapted, right? Like over the years, I started off obviously in recruitment. I was doing a combination of like screening calls and sales calls. Like that's pretty much it. I moved into internal recruitment, where it's much more about like stakeholder management, process-driven aspects, and still the screening calls. But then you're moving into people operations. You're like, what are the commercial needs? How can we build like a people-centric organization? And now I run a consultancy. So I'm like, right, I'm kind of founder of this, so I've got to like work on like everything, and start to hand off bits where possible. So there's three. It's like a kind of concept, like a diagram with three circles, kind of acting as a Venn. Is like, what does the company need? What do I love doing? And what am I great at? And you've got to balance like these three areas constantly. So if I take screening calls, I just detest screening calls at this point. Like I worked out, I'd probably done somewhere between 10 and 12,000 phone screens in my life. Like if I look at my entire recruitment career, I never want to do a phone screen again, right? I'm probably quite good at it, but it's not a big thing for me. But sometimes it's useful for the company. So it's like, right, I don't want to spend all of my time doing this, but I know it's useful for the company. There are other areas, when I look at my development, I'm like, okay, cool. Actually, I've probably over the last few years, I had to get better at sales, and I kind of tested and learned my approach there. And actually, I really enjoy that now. So to make this useful for the business, I should spend more time on that, because my enjoyment around, like certain aspects of process, really bad with process, and delivery, my co-founder Al is much better. So maybe he should be spending time on that, and I'll spend more time on sales, or like giving workshops or training managers, because that's where I can add more value. So I kind of see it in those three areas, and then balance it over time.
Interesting. Yeah, thanks for sharing those tips. And as a final topic to wrap up, and obviously I know it's a big one, and obviously lots of companies are now navigating through this change. But perhaps you could talk a little bit about what you're seeing with your clients and broadly in the industry as to how companies are tackling the remote versus in-person challenge following the pandemic. And
where are you wanting to start, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, perhaps you could talk a bit about some of the trends in terms of where you're seeing how you're seeing your customers tackle this,
Yep.
and if there are any sort of tips in terms of things that really need to be considered, or big red flags that also need to be taken into account.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like, I think firstly, I'll keep it broad at the beginning. Like, I don't think anyone has the answer. And I think, I've seen a few interviews with the chap from GitLab. Can't remember his name off the top of my head. I think it's Ryan Murphy. I'm going to go with Ryan Murphy, or Darren Murphy, one of those. But even he admits, like, he's like, we don't have this worked out, right? Like, we're a distributed first business, and I think companies are struggling at the highest level, because they don't have the answers, and no one has the answers. They're secondarily struggling because there are two issues at play. One is, how do we work well in a distributed sense, and how do we work well in a distributed sense in a pandemic? And then in the third piece is like, what comes next? And that's the really hard piece. Is like, are we going to remain fully remote? Do we have an office? Do we have some offices? What's the function of those offices going to be? Or do we want to bring everyone back together? And I think if I'm thinking about kind of one piece, one challenge that I can clearly see that I think everyone's like blindly walking into is that hybrid work is going to be the hardest one to implement. But it's clear from all the surveys out there that it is absolutely the most popular choice, which is a really interesting piece, right? And I think a lot of companies are underweighting just how hard it's going to be to make a hybrid situation work from a learning perspective, from a management perspective, from a just configuration of your office perspective, from a development perspective, from a compensation perspective, from a communication perspective. All of these areas need thinking about when it comes to that. Whereas at least if you are like fully distributed, you've kind of got to go like async first. You run all your meetings separately, and that's fine. Like there's a clear practiced way of doing things. And actually, if you're co-located, again, like it might not be perfect, but there's a pretty clear playbook for making it work quite well for your teams. But I think the hybrid model is going to be the really hard one. And the companies I see kind of thinking about this well. I try to think of it. I can't think of any companies that are actually doing this really well off the top of my head, quite frankly. I think it's just going to be something that people figure out as they go. Some things are going to work, some things are going to fail, and I think the key thing is the planning, the strength of your communication skills as a leadership team, the strength of your ability to work as a broader business, and being super intentional about everything. Like that will certainly give people a good starting foundation, right?
Yeah, interesting.
So I've given you no answers there.
Well, I think as you say, it's a really challenging one. It's very telling that no examples come to mind in terms of companies that are navigating this well just yet. Because if they were, then obviously we'd be pointing towards these great examples, and clearly it's something that everybody's facing right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can give you examples of distributed. You're like, yeah, GitLab are doing this pretty darn well. Automatic doing this pretty darn well. Like they've been doing it for years. Like co-located, a family member of mine works at JP Morgan, and don't tell the government, but they've basically been co-located for the last 6 months, or at least his entire department has been. And he's like, suddenly we're just much more productive again. And I think this half in, half out. Yeah, it's just going to be that's the really tough one, because you're like, do we align with distributed? Do we align with co-located? If not, there's no playbook.
Yeah, absolutely. And to wrap up with a final question, obviously the audience is all people operations professionals. If you could recommend a book or two to the audience, what would your top recommendations be?
And I should probably just pick them off the shelf. I'm actually gonna do that. So pick some off the shelf behind me. Here we go. Number one. It's backwards because video, but Richard Thaler's Misbehaving. So it's about the making of behavioral economics. So I think one of the most fascinating things for me with working in people operation is this understanding that people don't do what you tell them to do just because you tell them to do it, right? As Thaler terms it, people aren't econs, right? So when governments come up with economic policy, they base it around this idea that people will kind of blindly submit to the will of the economic policy, whereas actually, and this is like super obvious in a startup, right? People don't just blindly submit to what they're told by leadership, and we're seeing this more now than ever. And you've got to understand and rationalize and get to the kind of psychological aspects of your approach as a business if you're going to be super successful. Right, now we're going to keep playing this game. Other ones that I found to be really good. I mean, like it's like this one's like super obvious one. Patty McCord's Powerful. Some bits are good, some bits are bad. Like work out what works for your organization. Radical candour's all well and good, but the radical part can often mean just being a bit of an ass to someone. So be careful that you make sure it works with your values. And then actually the one I really want to share is somewhat out of reach, but I should be able to just about get it. Here we go. This. Now you won't find this on many a bookshelf. But for those who've been through the British Army, they'll know this. So this is handed out to officers when they pass out. And actually, I would say that if I'm thinking about like a book on leadership, this is the single most fascinating book I've read on leadership to date. It pulls from journals, diaries, reports from military leaders across the years. Like when you think about a startup, you go to work, and quite fundamentally, like if you mess up, nobody dies. So like imagine a situation where actually you're responsible for the lives of other humans. We'd say the lives of men, because predominantly British Army back in the day, it has been the lives of men, right? And actually, to kind of ground some of you, gives a bit of grounding to it, right? You're not, it's not a life and death situation. Actually, there are far harder situations. And how did people deal with the feelings and the thoughts of men within those situations in these days now, the feelings of everyone, and how can you work to be an empathetic and impactful leader in a situation where no one's going to die.
Super interesting. And I think the fact that you shared 3 books there on 3 very different topics speaks to the breadth of people operations and the skill sets required in order to create a great company culture at the end of the day.
I'd say that's about right.
Excellent. Well, Matt, this has been a fascinating conversation, and thank you so much for joining us.
Cheers for having me, Andy. It's been a pleasure as always.
Excellent. Thanks for listening to this episode of People Over Perks by Leapsome. We're available on the Leapsome YouTube channel and all major podcasting platforms, so you can hit subscribe to receive each episode as it's released. We also have an email newsletter and a Slack community where you'll find great resources and discussions on how to build a high-performing, humane and diverse company culture. You can find the link in the show notes, or you can head to the resources section at leapsome.com. Thanks for joining us, and see you next time.